Hi, my name is Andrew McLaren, and I want to talk to you about the AP Chemistry exam and how you can get as good of a score as possible and understand the points, because some of that stuff could affect ultimately if you got like a 4 or a 5. If you just have a few things clarified, it can really help you get up another grade level. So in this video, we're talking about those scores and points, the overview of the big picture. Then we'll look more specifically at examples within the free response so you can see, oh, you get a point for doing this, you do not get a point for doing that, so you can understand that. And also clarifying what exactly content-wise will be on the exam is pretty important, because sometimes teachers will do things in the class and students will, I work as a tutor, so I get a lot of students being like, I can't do this. And at a certain point, I have to be like, okay, time out. While you can't do that, you can do this, which is really what is on the exam. And this is more for the college class. So you're going to have like a whole other year at least before you're really being assessed on this. So that's important to understand for the purposes of directing your time in studying, right? It's like, okay, well, don't do that. Do this instead. Use your time wisely for getting points. So on the really big picture on the score, you're used to hearing people talk about getting an AP score of like a 5 being like really good, 4 being might get college credit, and 3 typically you don't get college credit for this. But you can see that the scores are right here, and they're giving you like percents of students that get that. So you can see nearly half of students are not going to be getting college credit for this class, but that corresponds to getting a score of about 41 out of 100 points total being the cutoff for the 2 to the 3. So it's points wise, you don't have to earn a lot of points to do decently on this test. Like a lot of people think a 5 is like an A, so they think it's kind of like 90%, but you can get like 72 out of 100 of the points on this exam and still get the 5, which is the best score possible. So just keep that in mind, that the cutoff for this is a little bit different than what you're used to in a traditional grade setting. Um, but there's other things to keep in mind in addition to that as well. So they're going to be adjusting these scores slightly for each year. Like it's saying 72 for this year for 2022, but like for different years, they'll have slightly different cutoffs. So they'll maybe make it be like 68 or 75 being that cutoff for the 5, depending on if students do better or worse that year. So they're trying to get a nice distribution where they've got the A being a pretty rare thing. So if people do better on the exam, then they're going to have a higher cutoff for a 5. So it's kind of like a curve, but it's not technically a curve. And that's generally how they do the exam. And there's 50 points from the free response section and 50 points from the multiple choice section. There aren't like, I think that it's changed slightly the number of points in multiple choice. Like there's like 60 questions now in multiple choice, but those are worth 50 points. So they kind of take a portion of that and try and figure out how many out of 60 that is and how much that would be equivalent to if it was out of 50, and then combine that with the free response questions. So there's a little bit of averaging of points between those two sections, but you get half the points from free response and you get half of them from multiple choice, and it's been like that for over a decade. So generally, the more points, the better. That still applies. Um, but it's a little bit complicated in how they exactly put the pieces together. But you could just think of it as 50 points from here and 50 from there, um, and that helps you with the big picture. So for both sections of the AP exam, you earn points. They aren't taken off for getting wrong answers, but if you like say something that contradicts yourself, like if you say something correct and then immediately say something that contradicts that's wrong, you're not going to get the points for the correct thing you said. So I've heard that called sometimes the shotgun strategy, where you just throw a ton of information on paper. But then sometimes if you say something that's wrong, you can lose points. So you want to be kind of careful about just throwing things that you're not certain about into short answer problems and only saying what you really do know, but also leaving nothing blank. So if there's a question where it's blank, you can get points for that. Even if you're not super confident about your answer, that's better than no points. But don't put too much in, because you might contradict yourself and lose the points that you did earn in that section. So multiple choice is fairly straightforward. You get a point or you don't. Free response, you got to be a little bit careful but there's generally 1 or 2 points per section. And I'll go over what that means by looking at specific grading guidelines that graders have used in the free response question. That's basically what I'm going to go over in this section. So if you just Google AP Chem practice test or these previous exam questions, this is a really awesome set of resources that anyone can access without needing to sign into their online platform. So I really like this because you can see the free response questions, which is kind of useful. So your teacher will probably be pulling questions from this anyways, but what's more important for students to see is the scoring guidelines. So you understand how points are earned. And so you can see for this question 1, which we were just looking at, you get 1 point for getting this correct answer here. It does need the significant figures of like 3 sig figs to be present right there. So sig figs are relevant, and they typically also do want the units and other things like that. So you get the point for getting the answer. It's not like you get a point for units and a point for the number. A lot of teachers will do that. That is not necessarily the case here. If there's 2 points, usually there's like for part C, there's a number right here that you're going to calculate from one part of a calculation, and then a second calculation where you need to combine some numbers. So there's 2 real steps to like the math, which is where like the points kind of come from there. So that's pretty important to get the idea of sig figs and understand how you get these points. They'll oftentimes in here show you example responses for things where it's like they have to kind of draw things out on there. And so this is a pretty good thing to clarify exactly what they're looking for. But there's something that I think it's on the 2021 exam. I've seen this one thing with sig figs. It's important to clarify that sometimes they'll take different answers, and it has to do with our sig fig rules. Yes, right here. So you can see right here, they're saying that you could get the 0.0319 molar if you carried the decimals. So technically speaking, you should round a number from a previous part and use that rounded number to like 3 sig figs. So this is not actually like what you get in the calculator. There's probably more sig figs or insignificant figures in that number. So if you use those, if you carried those down here, you're going to get a slightly different answer. So the sig fig rule that they're not caring so much about is if you've used a like raw number from the calculator or a rounded thing from a previous section. So if you're on part C, if you're using the rounded number from part B, that technically is the rule. You're supposed to use reported numbers in sig figs, but that's the one rule that like it's a little bit less important than doing like 3 sig figs and multiplication, or when you're doing addition, subtraction, knowing the place value that you're in. Like for example, part B, the place value is pretty important for limiting that there. So knowing those rules is much more important. Knowing to use the previously reported number or not, that is less important to the AP Chem exam. They'll have some exceptions for that one rule with sig figs, but generally the sig fig rules do need to be followed in AP Chem for you to get the points for the answer. So just keep that in mind, that that's important. And these scoring guidelines are incredible because they just tell you exactly what is and is not going to get you points. There's also something called the Chief Reader Report, which is really useful because it can show you specifically what they're looking for in terms of misconceptions. So if someone in this one question was focusing on the Gibbs free energy or change in S instead of enthalpy, that could cause them to lose points. So if you use a term incorrectly, that will cause you to not get the point for that section. So that's really important to just kind of understand and not use concepts inappropriately, because that is how you really like will lose points. But if you've got no idea, put something down, because you're not going to lose points by putting something down if you've got nothing down. You got nothing to lose, right? So if you want to clarify if something's on the exam or not, or if it's something maybe a little extra that your teacher is doing, it's really important to look at what we call the course description. It's a really big PDF. I think it's like 200 to 300 pages long. You do not need to read all of it, but it is good to know how to use Control F on this to find certain things, because you might think that something's on the exam, or your teacher might think that something's on the exam that actually isn't. And it's pretty easy to confirm that if we're looking at like solubility. So if we look at solubility here, there is one of the standards on here that talks about the solubility rules. And you can see it kind of written right here. There is only like 4 things that you need to memorize are always soluble, and that's all you really need for the solubility rules. There's a huge amount of tables that teachers might make you memorize. College classes, unfortunately, still focus on this, but the AP questions with how they're written, you'll be able to figure out like, okay, sodium is soluble on both sides of the reaction. And so whatever that is with sodium cannot be the precipitant, so it has to be the other thing that is present as a product. So there's some things like that that your teachers may give you more than what you really need. Another common one is the polyprotic acids. A lot of teachers will show students polyprotic acids, and you might have to do something with like the curves, like just the like pKa1 and pKa2, and just an estimate of what's the most common ion that's present. But you're not going to need to get the exact concentration. So you're not going to need to do like ice chart problems. These are very tricky ice chart conceptual things. You probably will get one question in a like college chemistry class on this, but even if you got that wrong, you'll probably still get a B on that exam if you got everything else down, because it's not a major focus, that math, is so much as understanding like, okay, if you're above and below that plateau and these titration curves, which thing is the most common. So there's some things on here that teachers will even like do example problems, like they might do the ice chart problem for one of these as an example problem. Kind of wish they wouldn't, because a lot of students will get concerned by seeing those problems, be like, I can't do acids and bases. It's like, yes, you can. You get the big picture. And typically that's one of the biggest areas that my students have a lack of confidence in, is acid-base questions, because practice problems that you're doing are typically harder than what is actually on the AP exam. It's like the big picture questions typically that you see on there.